From Shinji Mikami, the mind that brought you Resident Evil, comes The Evil Within. Trailers and commercials alike have been gearing gamers up for a fright fest completely appropriate for the holiday season and much needed in the new console generation. But The Evil Within is a horror game by definition only. Don't expect it to frighten you at all. Certainly there is gore, and there's visuals that appear to be wrenched from hell itself, but the scares just aren't there. Psychological horror? No. Survival horror? Not even close. Jump scares? Nope. Feelings of isolation? Not really. Creepy story? Meh. It is horror by setting and atmosphere alone. Otherwise, it's simply a third-person shooter with light puzzle elements and extremely limited ammo. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news. Believe me, I'm disappointed too. But before I go into where this crazy train has gone off its rails, here's the basics of The Evil Within and what it's done right. In The Evil Within, gamers play as Sebastian, a veteran police detective in Crimson City, as he responds to an emergency call of what can only be described as a mass murder in Beacon Mental Hospital. There he faces off against Ruvik, a ghostly-looking character in a white hood, in an alternate dimension filled with hellish monsters and gore and giblets. Sebastian's enemies are incredibly lethal, and ammunition and health supplies are rare to boot. Within Sebastian's arsenal is a very large combat knife that can dispatch lesser enemies if caught unaware from behind, a pistol, a shotgun, a magnum, a sniper rifle, and a crossbow that is capable of firing several types of bolts with varying elemental effects. Gamers familiar with Resident Evil 4 and its ilk will be more than comfortable with The Evil Within's third-person control scheme, but unlike most shooters and the recent Resident Evil games, Sebastian can take a stealthy approach to his enemies, which helps in ammunition and first aid conservation. A green goopy brain liquid can be found in jars in the environment or collected from fallen enemies and spent on upgrading Sebastian's abilities and weapons. Not every skill can be fully unlocked within a single playthrough, so tactically upgrading skills to your playstyle can have some pretty drastic effects on the game's difficulty. Visually, the game has some very interesting lighting effects and filters that help set the proper atmosphere, though at times the game is muddier than it needs to be to make its point. The audio design is also well done, with some great monster sound effects and an awesome use of a limited soundtrack. The artificial letterboxing is added to give the game a more cinematic feel. If you're in the mood for a challenging game, The Evil Within will certainly put you through the paces. My first run on survival mode was just shy of 19 hours, and I died a whopping 131 times. The main game itself is of average difficulty, but there are a few boss encounters and puzzles that will leave even the most patient of players a bit frustrated. But greater frustration often gives way to a greater sense of accomplishment when finally completing the task. For the most part, the gameplay is pretty fun. Destroying evil baddies in a twisted world has always scratched a certain itch for gamers. I can say I enjoyed myself while playing the game, but in the end, I have a very large issue with The Evil Within. The Evil Within has no identity of its own, and subsequently, it's not a true horror experience. A carnival haunted house is just an amalgamation of scary things slapped together with some loud noises. It has the potential to be truly frightening, but there's no story or context to give it lasting meaning. There's nothing below the surface. It's just fake blood, toy skulls, flashing lights, and empty wheelchairs. The same can be said for The Evil Within. There is nothing below the surface. What little story can be found in the game is totally disposable. The twist at the end was enough to make my eyes roll. Good, lasting horror almost always has an allegory. The Evil Within is just a digital haunted house without any substance. There are entirely too many enemies and characters that resemble but are legally distinct from other horror experiences that do have substance. There is a Samara Morgan, complete with long, scary dark hair. Instead of having her die by drowning, she dies by the polar opposite means in The Evil Within. She burns to death. There is a Pyramid Head, but instead of having a pyramid-shaped head, he has a cube on his head. Instead of carrying an oversized sharp object, he carries an oversized blunt object. Ray Liotta better watch out because there's a brain surgeon who shares a startling similarity to Hannibal Lecter. There is a Leatherface that's just... it's Leatherface. There are creatures and environments seemingly pulled from Slither, shots that are practically one-to-one from the Resident Evil series. At first, I thought it was just an homage, but there's so much of it, The Evil Within just becomes a shell of other horror experiences more worthy of accolades. And the finishing touch for me is the letterboxing, which is an annoying visual hindrance the entire way through the game. But the letterboxing gives the impression that The Evil Within doesn't want to be a video game at all. It would rather be a film. Video games don't need to be more cinematic. Video games have surpassed cinema in terms of immersion, which makes them ideal for horror. The first few levels of the game show true promise. The environments are more open, there are more traps to fiendishly lure your powerful enemies into, and there are even a few neat puzzles, like the bomb in a box, that will put you on edge. Do you dare open it and lose progress, or do you backtrack and try to save? Stealth in early stages is also much more mandatory because of your limited means of defense. But later levels abandon the more open gameplay in favor of straight-up action, and the bombs in a box seem to have been forgotten too. That seems to be the mentality of the entire game. Once it gets into a good working groove, it throws a change-up, and the following level isn't nearly as fun. So, The Evil Within is not a man's slow descent into guilt, madness, and his own personal hell. It's not a social statement about the evils of large corporations, religion, consumerism, xenophobia, racism, conformity, etc. There's no creepy story that will stick with you and give you the shivers after you've stopped playing, or make you worry about what may be lurking in the dark corners of your basement. It's simply a third-person shooter with limited ammo, some floaty old-school controls, cool lighting effects, and a gory setting. While you're in the game, it's fun and can be a blast to play, but once you turn it off, it won't stick with you. This video was made possible through generous fan donations on Patreon.